Reminder to everyone that this is for educational use only. Our group is allowing our instructor, Mr. Rodan Ardines, to use this as an educational matter.
So, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a deeply troubling crime that involves the exploitation of vulnerable individuals for profit. Imagine a scenario where someone is lured into a promising job opportunity in a foreign country, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of abuse and exploitation. So, this is just one example of how human trafficking can be manifested. At its core, human trafficking involves three key elements: force, fraud, and coercion. Victims are often deceived or coerced into situations where they lose control over their own lives. They may be forced into labor, such as working in factories, farms, or domestic servitude, under inhumane conditions and for little to no pay. In other cases, they may be coerced into commercial sex work, enduring physical and emotional abuse. So, what makes human trafficking particularly insidious is its hidden nature. So, victims are often isolated, threatened, and manipulated, making it difficult for them to seek help or escape their situations. Traffickers are often within vast networks, exploiting legal loopholes and crossing international borders to evade detection. The impact of human trafficking is devastating. Victims suffer physical and psychological trauma, facing threats to their health, safety, and dignity. They may experience a loss of identity and agency, living in a constant fear and isolation. Trafficking also fuels other criminal activities, such as organized crime and corruption, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation and suffering. The efforts to combat human trafficking include legislative measures, law enforcement initiatives, victim support services, and public awareness campaigns. So it's crucial to address the root causes of trafficking, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of education, while also empowering survivors and holding traffickers accountable. So human trafficking involves three key elements, like what I mentioned a while ago. So the first one is force. So this element refers to the use of physical restraint or violence to compel someone into labor or services against their will. So this can include physical abuse, confinement, or threats of harm to the victim or their loved ones. Next is fraud. Fraud involves deceptive tactics used to trick individuals into situations where they are exploited. This could include false promises of employment, education, or a better life, leading victims to unknowingly enter into exploitative situations. And the third one would be coercion. So, coercion involves the use of threats, intimidation, or psychological manipulation to control and exploit victims. This can include threats of violence, manipulation of debt, bondage, or psychological abuse to keep victims compliant and unable to seek help or escape. So, these three elements, force, fraud, and coercion, are often used in combination by traffickers to maintain control over their victims and profit from their exploitation. So, identifying and understanding these elements is crucial in combating human trafficking and protecting vulnerable individuals from falling victim to these heinous crime.
So, what are example of human trafficking? So, human trafficking can take various of forms. First, sex trafficking. So, sex trafficking is forcing individuals into commercial sex acts through fraud, coercion, or force. So, this sex trafficking is really globally issues right now. Now, we can see or so in the internet, there is someone who is forced to do a sex videos or something like that. So that was the example of sex trafficking. So the second issues or the second example of human trafficking is labor trafficking. So exploiting individuals for forced labor in industries like agriculture, construction, domestic work, and manufacturing. So the best example of this is like OFW or someone recruiting like di kanami tong pasaligan sila na pabuhaton sila or dagan sila og kanang idea or unsay ilang trabaho in that place or in that nation na dapat nila adtuan. So while ikaw nga wala ka kabalo unsay consequence na imong mabuhat ana or ilang plano about towards sa imuha, so ni-apply ka, so na-scam ka, so pag abot nimo dito sa lugar nga dapat imong trabaho kay example domestic work, pag abot nimo dito kay himuon kang kuan kana sila ray maka-benefit sa imuha, like example pahimuon nga pasayawon ka or himuon kang sex slaves or something like that nya, like agriculture, construction, imong gi-applyan dito kay manufacturing nya, pag abot nimo dito sa ilang lugar kay ipa construction ra ka, buhat ka sa init, ipatrabaho ka sa dili nimo gi-applyan na trabaho. So that was the example of labor trafficking. So second, third, so child trafficking, recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving children for exploitation, often for labor or sexual purposes. So this is very common na kanang there's someone na mga bata na makidnap or mga missing or forced nga kanang they will say it na ilang adapon kanang magpa kuan sila ba na kani kay ako ni mga adapt sila mga bata, mga scam sila. So for own purposes nila sa mao pa himo kang labor kanang na sila plano towards sa imuha ba, like the common of this is sexual purposes kanang mga bata nga himuon karon para sa mga kwarta sila, pakita nila ilang kuan motives towards them. So that was the example of child trafficking. So for forced marriage or forcing individuals, open women and girls into marriages without their consent, which can be involve exploitation and abuse. So this forced marriage, I saw a videos internet that was she is a OFW in Saudi Arabia or yeah. So kanang gi-force siya into marriage sa iyang amo into someone nga kay need nga marag magminyo bitaw og kuan kay for on their own goods ba, like kung magminyo makaminyo to siya or kuan by the use of his amo katong amo nga makahatag og girl sa katong another person, so nga ikapalit, so mo to sa gay forced marriage siya bisan dili niya gusto. So I think that was the best example of forced marriage. So lastly is for my example about human trafficking is organ trafficking. So illegally trading organs for transplantation, often exploiting vulnerable individuals through coercion or deception. So this is the best common nga katong mahadlok ta nakanabit ang ingon nga ay may mang baan nga manguha. So this is the best example nga if makuan ka nila kuhaon imong mga important organs sa imo like heart, kidneys para i-transfer nila sa another person nga nag-need. So that's why mingon ma-missing ka or something like that. So that was the best example of human trafficking.
Examples of human trafficking are domestic servitude, domestic work trafficking in diplomatic household, trafficking for illegal adoptions, and last, trafficking for forced criminal activities. Domestic servitude are individuals, usually women and children, are trafficked into private households where they are forced to work as domestic servants under conditions of abuse and confinement. They often work long hours with little or no pay and are subjected to physical and emotional abuse. Domestic work trafficking in diplomatic households are some domestic workers are trafficked to work in the homes of diplomats or expatriates. These workers often endure long hours, no pay, and physical and psychological abuse. But their situation can be particularly difficult to address due to diplomatic immunity of their employers. Trafficking for illegal adoptions, babies and young children are sometimes kidnapped or bought from their families and sold for illegal adoptions. They can involve forging documents and deceiving adoptive parents about the origin of the children. Trafficking for forced terminal activities are individuals, including children, are trafficked and forced to engage in illegal activities such as drug trafficking, cultivation of illegal drugs, or other forms of organized crime. For instance, traffickers might force victims to smuggle drugs eternally, or cultivate cannabis in illicit grow operations. The victims of domestic servitude are isolated in private homes, making it harder for authorities to detect. The personal nature of their work environment also expresses them to continuous surveillance and control by their traffickers. Diplomatic immunity shields diplomats from prosecution under the host country laws, making it difficult to hold them accountable for trafficking and abuse. This legal protection can leave victims with limited options for seeking justice and assistance.
So, what are the three elements of human trafficking? So, the first three elements of human trafficking is the act. This is what traffickers do to control people. It includes actions like kidnapping or transporting individuals from one place to another. So, act it is how a person or how a traffickers do an action in which they kidnap a persons or transporting a person that they kidnap in one place to another. Then means second is the means. This is the method of traffickers to use to keep control over the victims. It can traits like violence, lies, or forcing them to against their will. So if they kidnap that person, so there is involved money. It belongs to means purpose. This is why traffickers do what they do. They exploit people for things like forced labor, sex works, or taking organs. They treat people like commodities to make money. So, if they kidnap that person, if he or she did not pay, so there is a purpose in which they make forced labor, sex work, taking organs of that persons, in which they can benefit to gain money. So, the three elements of human trafficking are very violence, in which its act means purpose. So human trafficking, it is how a person's being involved in different kind of traits or lies.
Hi guys, my name is Jap Alvarez and today I'll be talking about how can you relate human trafficking to migration. So, human trafficking often preys on vulnerable migrants, promising better opportunities but instead exploiting from them for forced labor or sexual exploitation. So, migration can expose people to trafficking risk, especially when legal protections are lacking or when migrants are desperate for employment. So here's an example. So imagine a young woman from rural village in a developing country dreams of a better life in a prosperous city. So she migrates in search of work but falls victim to traffickers who promise her a job in a restaurant. However, upon arrival, she's forced into domestic servitude without pay and unable to leave due to threats. So this illustrates how migration can intersect with human trafficking, exploiting the vulnerability of migrants seeking opportunities. So uh, let's talk about its vulnerability and desperation. So when people migrate, they usually do so to escape tough situations like poverty, war, or natural disasters. These conditions make them desperate for opportunities, which traffickers exploit. For instance, someone might promise them a good job in another country, but once they arrive, the reality is very different. They might end up forced into labor or trapped in abusive conditions. It's a risky journey. Migrants who can't use legal routes often turn to smugglers. These journeys are dangerous and smugglers can easily turn into traffickers. So they might take away the migrants' documents, threaten them, or force them into exploitative situations to pay off debts for their transport. And it is also a lack of protection. In many places, migrants, especially those without legal status, don't have a strong legal protections. This makes it easy for traffickers to exploit them because they know the migrants are less likely to go to the authorities for help, fearing deportation or other legal consequences. And there's also a psychological manipulation in there. So migrants often face isolation and language barriers in new countries, which traffickers exploit to maintain control. They might be threatened, manipulated, or made to feel helpless and alone, making it hard for them to seek for help or escape in this situation. So, by understanding and addressing these connections, we can better protect migrants from becoming victim of human trafficking. That's all. Thank you.
The adverse effects of human trafficking to globalization. As you can see in the slide, these are the adverse effects of human trafficking to globalization. The first is economic impact. How important is economic impact to globalization? The second is social consequences. The third is legal and regulatory challenges. The fourth is security concerns, reputation damage, and the last is humanitarian crisis. So, what is adverse effects? From the word adverse means harmful, or it describes something that creates negative effects or conditions. So, human trafficking significantly undermines the benefits of globalization by exploiting individuals and perpetuating severe human rights abuses. This illicit trade disrupts the equitable and ethical foundations needed for global integration, fostering environments of exploitation rather than cooperations. So, victims of human trafficking uh, suffer from physical and physiological abuse, deprived of their basic rights and freedoms. This exploitation erodes the social fabric and hinders the development of human capital, which is essential for sustainable economic growth. Uh, by fostering inequality and injustice, human trafficking contradicts the principle of fairness and opportunity that underpin globalization, such as exploitation not only damages the social fabric but also hinders the development of human capital, which is crucial for sustainable economic progress. By perpetuating inequality and injustice, human trafficking contradicts the principles of fairness and opportunity that globalization seeks to promote. That's all.
Good day, sir. I am Injun Cadet Andaya, and the topic that is assigned to me is all about what is the adverse effect of human trafficking in globalization. So, human trafficking, unfortunately, is one of the adverse or one of the dark sides of globalizations. It's a multifaceted crime with far-reaching adverse effects on both individuals and societies. And its impacts intersect with various aspects of globalization. So, first of all is the human rights violation. So, human trafficking inherently violates the basic human rights and dignity of individuals. So, it commodifies humans, treating them as objects for exploitation than recognizing their inherent worth and autonomy. The second adverse effect is the exploitation of vulnerable populations. So globalization has led to increased movement of people across borders for various reasons like seeking better economic opportunities or escaping conflict. However, this also creates opportunities to traffickers to exploit vulnerable populations, including migrants, refugees, and marginalized communities. The third is the undermining labor standards. So traffic individuals often end up in forced and labor situations, working in deplorable conditions for little to no pay. So this not only labor standards but also creates unfair competition in global markets as traffickers cut costs by exploiting their victims. The fourth is the health and well-being. So, victims of trafficking endure physical and psychological trauma. So, they may suffer from injuries, diseases, and mental health issues as a result of the exploitation by experience. This is not only harms individuals but also strains healthcare systems, especially in countries with limited resources. The number five is the economic impacts. So, human trafficking can have significant economic impacts on both source and destination countries. So, in source countries, it can deprive communities of their workforce and potential contributors to the economy. So, in destination countries, it can lead to increased social services costs and decreased productivity due to the exploitation of trafficked individuals. The sixth is the security concerns. So, trafficking networks often operates across borders and may have links to other criminal activities such as drug trafficking and terrorism. So, this can undermine national and global security as well as efforts to combat organized crime. The last is the social cohesion. So the presence of trafficking undermines social cohesion by eroding trust within communities and perpetuating cycles of exploitations and vulnerability. It can also fuel resentment and xenophobia towards certain groups, especially migrant populations, who may be unfairly associated with trafficking. But addition to that, addressing human trafficking requires coordinated efforts at the local, the national, and the international levels, including enforcement of laws, protection of victims, and addressing root causes such as poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunities. In the context of globalization, collaboration between countries is crucial to combating this pervasive and harmful crime effectively. So that's all. Thank you.
What is the current state of human trafficking in the Philippines? Human trafficking remains a significant issue in the Philippines, with both domestic and international trafficking occurring. The government has been taking steps to combat it, including passing laws and implementing programs to protect victims and prosecute traffickers. However, challenges persist, including poverty, lack of awareness, and corruption, contributing to the continuation of this crime. One example is the traffic of Filipino women and children for commercial sexual exploitation, both domestically and internationally. Traffickers often prey on vulnerable individuals, including those from improvised backgrounds or those who lack education and awareness about the dangers of trafficking. Despite efforts by the government and the various organizations to combat this issue, it remains a persistent problem due to factors such as economic inequality, lack of enforcement in some areas, and the demand for cheap labor and sexual services.